Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I'd like to give a shout out to my Popbase. Popbase is this really cool little app where I put loads of content out for you guys to enjoy. You get to interact with a virtual mini-me. This is Mort, say hello. You get to play around with him and do loads of fun little activities with new content dropping every day. It'd be really cool if you guys would check it out, and it does help support me as a creator. So if you want to take a peek, see what it's all about, do so. The link is at the top of the description. Let me know what you think. It's free, by the way. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable. Grab your headlamps and let the darkness take control. I'm a 20-year-old female, and I live in a very religious state and grew up in a very religious household. But I myself have never been religious nor spiritual. I'm an atheist, horror enthusiast, and the paranormal has just never been something that scared me, but always something that's interested me. My hood rat friends and I love to go and explore abandoned towns and buildings. I've been doing this since I was 16 and never had any scary encounters other than some rats and raccoons. This past summer, my friend suggested we go visit one of our state's oldest cemeteries that's about 30 minutes up a canyon I live right next to. As we entered the tiny town and maybe 30 very old houses, he took me down a separate street to show me an old abandoned schoolhouse. Normally we would get out and go explore, but it was the middle of the day and raining heavily, so we just passed by. There's a plaque on the top of the school that reads 1904 and is surrounded by other very old abandoned cabins. All of the entryways were boarded up, and it appeared that there was no way in. It was an absolutely beautiful building, and I was very intrigued. The next night, I decided to go back up there with another friend of mine. We both get off work super late, so we didn't even end up heading up there until about 1:30 a.m. The drive up the canyon was fine. We listened to music and joked the entire time. But the second we turned onto the road leading us to this small ghost town, I felt sick to my stomach. I honestly can't even explain the exact feeling that I felt, other than pure terror and dread. I kept trying to write it off as general anxiety from driving so far in the dark. But as we got closer to school, the worse the feeling became. As we approached the building, I nervously suggested that we just drive around and see the building 360. As we did, I looked down at one of the doors that were completely boarded off the night before, and one door was open. Mind you, it had been raining for the past 48 hours. There was no way that someone would have went down there and opened that door. We pulled up down the street of the school next to one of the much older, very abandoned cabins. Reluctantly, I got out the car and locked the door. I thought that maybe I was overreacting and that I just needed to take a Xanax or something and calm down. But when I looked at my friend, I could tell he was very uneasy as well. Very out of character for the both of us. We started walking up the street towards the schoolhouse. The feeling in my stomach got worse, and before I knew it, we were standing on the road in front of the schoolhouse. I looked down at my feet, about to step onto the grass. Every single fiber in my body was telling me not to step into the property. I'd never felt this feeling this strong before. I've never been this scared in my life. I wrapped my arm around my friends and forced myself to step onto the grass, even though I knew I shouldn't have. I started to walk around outside the building, just to get a closer look of the outside. We're about 15 steps in when we come around the side of the building to a ton of trees. We kept walking. Before I could even open my mouth to express how fearful I was, my eyes welled up with tears, and at the same time, we both stopped walking. Neither of us could physically take another step, no matter how hard either of us tried. We both looked at each other, and without saying a single word, bolted back to my car. The ride home, we both came out clean and told each other how scared we were. My friend got really quiet and said, "I don't believe in the paranormal, but when we first drove around the school, I looked up and saw this girl staring at me from one of the windows." The scary thing is about how this isn't just the fact that he saw this. There's little to no information about this town whatsoever, but the one only thing I found on the school were 2 separate Facebook posts, one saying, "I wanted to go in and explore this building, but as I drove towards it I got such a bad feeling I had to turn around and leave," and the other, "I felt like I was being watched the entire time I lived across the street. One day I opened my window to find a little girl staring at me from one of the windows in the school." The rest of the night, I was too scared to sleep. I ended up calling my friend back over, and we just sat on the couch in my living room and watched Disney films to make us feel better. But in the days passing, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. I kept having super strange and vivid dreams. I didn't feel comfortable sleeping in my room anymore. Fast forward 2 weeks. That weekend was my friend's birthday, so we'd been drinking for the past 2 days at an Airbnb. My liver loves me, and I know it. One of my friends and I went back to my house to grab a few things, and I had a shower while we were there. He was super tired, and still a little intoxicated, and I told him he could lay down on the couch in my room and take a nap while I showered. After I had showered, I got dressed and walked back into my room, and I'll never forget this. My friend, mind you, was half drunk and half asleep, looks up at me and says, "Who's the guy in your closet?" It didn't really register to me at first, so I laughed and replied, "There's no one in my closet." He looks at me very seriously and says, "No, there's a man standing in your closet." He then woke up fully and explained that he was having a strange dream, but then it clicked. I felt the overwhelming sense of dread flow over me again. I had brought something back with me. I ended up begging my mother to have a priest come bless our home, again very out of character for me, and after the blessing I immediately felt comfortable and happy in my home again. But I think that's more of a mental thing for me, just being raised in a strict religious household, because I'm still definitely not religious. I still don't know what to make of this experience. I don't know what I believe anymore, but I'm convinced that there was something watching over me that night when I went to the schoolhouse, because I had a feeling that if I'd actually have gone in, it would have gotten a lot worse. This story takes place when I was a boy, very young, with a thirsty desire to travel. My friends and I had banded together all our money to go on a trip through Africa. It was an enlightening experience, and on one of our experiences, we were taking a tour through an abandoned mine town. We were allowed to roam around this town for a little while, and as we were going our separate ways, the tour guide gave us very specific instructions to stay within the ring. There was an area where we were not permitted to go, and we all agreed that we wouldn't go there. However, I was absent-mindedly throwing my hat into the air, and my hat was blown by the wind into the area we're not supposed to go in. So, me knowing I wouldn't be in the area for very long, did I scoot past and make my way there to collect my hat. Once I'd already passed this barrier, did I feel confident that I could at least have a peek. There was a small hut where my hat had landed, and I thought for the sake of curiosity that I might as well look inside. I grabbed my hat, put it on my head, and looked into this small structure. There were still decaying beds on the floor made from straw, and other random assortments of garbage. Nothing worth talking about. I turn around and make my way back across the line. Later that day, my tour guide is finishing up as we are arriving back at the hotel, when one of the women of the tour asks why we weren't allowed to go to that part of the town. He says that there is a curse laid on that town, apparently, and that bad energy and spirits follow those who have stood on the cursed ground, and that even if we don't believe it, it is mostly for our safety. He says this in a jolly tone, one to signify that he doesn't believe it either, and that we should take it with a grain of salt. Most of the tour bus laughs, and the tour ends shortly after. When we arrive back to the hotel, I instantly go to bed, forgetting all about the land I stood on that was allegedly cursed. But during the middle of the night, I hear something, footsteps and talking, coming up to the side of my bed, talking in a language I don't understand, and when I open my eyes, there's nothing there. I try going back to sleep, and a few hours later, the talking continues. Is there someone in the room? I turn around, facing the direction where the noise is coming from, and open my eyelids extremely slowly and purposefully. And standing there is a man, or at least a shadow of a man, made entirely of dark mass. I can't conceal my dread. My eyes open wide, and I scream loudly. The shadow, the thing, looks down upon me and then vanishes. I knew at that moment that I had messed up and that I should never have stood on the cursed ground. When we go back to the tour guide for the final leg of our tour, I tell him what I had done, but don't make it sound as bad as what I actually did. And he told me not to worry and that we would be fine. However, the shadow man kept appearing for me every night for the rest of my time in that country. It took about a week, but after a while I finally stopped seeing him. I was very scared that I would be cursed for life, which is something I couldn't deal with. A word of caution to you all. If you are told to not step on cursed ground, don't. The consequences are severely spooky. So my cousin and I thought it would be a good idea to visit a ghost town that was located nearby. We had heard stories from other relatives saying they saw a woman and a daughter in a dress standing or walking by the side of the road. Whenever they'd pass her, their cell phones would either die or completely lose signal, and one of my cousins said his car stopped working as soon as he passed the woman. 7 of us got into a big van and went to the ghost town to see if all the paranormal activity was true. We were talking and laughing in the van, making fun of the people who did get scared of the town and that they were just probably imagining things. None of us had been to a ghost town before, and we didn't know when we would reach it. As we crossed a bridge that led to the ghost town, the scenery completely changed. A huge fog appeared out of nowhere and covered the whole town and bridge. The laughter in the van died, and it was dead quiet because we knew we had entered the ghost town area. We parked the van on a dirt road that was a little further than the entrance to the ghost town. We turned off the car and closed all the windows and just sat there looking into the dark, empty houses. It felt as if the houses were full of ghosts, just looking at the van, as if we had invaded their space. The atmosphere was so tense, and after 5 minutes of just sitting there in the dark, the driver of the van suddenly turned the car on and drove out. We all wondered why he'd left so suddenly, and we asked him, but he wouldn't answer us. He parked at a nearby gas station, and his face was extremely pale. He finally started talking and said he saw a little girl walking behind one of the houses, coming towards the van. He was so scared. You could see him trembling. He ran inside the gas station, and the cashier saw his pale face, and surprisingly, he just asked the driver if we'd just come back from the ghost town. We told the cashier that we did, and that our driver supposedly saw a little ghost girl. The cashier told us that he had passed by the town a few times and saw the same thing. He advised us that if we wanted to experience something paranormal, we should wash the car down with those little window wash things that they have at gas stations. We thought this was a good idea, so we all went out and washed the car. We washed the top of the car, the sides, the doors and the windows and all the mirrors, washed all the windows inside the car, and we took paper towels and completely dried the car inside and out. We were at the gas station parking lot for a good 10 minutes, talking to see if we were going to go back to the ghost town or just go home. We agreed to switch drivers and head back. We went back onto the dirt road and travelled into the centre of town. We sat in the van for 15 minutes, just looking out for signs of a girl or signs of activity in the houses. I can't explain how tense the atmosphere was. 7 of us, all aged 17 plus, in a van, and we had to hold hands. It was weird, but everyone was so scared we couldn't help it. After 20 minutes in the centre of the town, I had begun to see a figure in the distance. It seemed like the little girl everyone was talking about, but something was odd. It didn't look like the girl was walking. She was making these odd movements as if she was limping. I told everyone to look into the distance, and everyone said they saw her also. We watched, and after 3 to 5 seconds, the figure looked as if she were getting up. We realized she was crawling and had begun to stand up. Right when she stood up, the figure disappeared into the blackness, and a loud bang hit the driver's side. The gravel beneath the van made sounds as if someone was crawling under the car, and 3 very distinct thumping noises came from under the car. The thumping was directly below my feet, and I could feel something hitting the car. Something also stepped onto the back bumper of the van, and a small thump could be heard hitting the back window. I made the decision that we should leave immediately, and so we did. We got to the gas station, everyone got out of the car, and we all saw it. On the driver's side mirror was a large fresh handprint. We were all freaked out. I made my way to the back of the car, and there was a little footprint on the back bumper, along with a set of handprints and fingerprints on the back window. But they just wouldn't come off the car. We sat at the gas station for 30 minutes after that, just freaking out, and the prints wouldn't dry. When you touched the prints, they wouldn't feel wet, but they'd look as if they were. Everyone was scared to go back in the van, but we eventually did, and we made sure not to drive the van directly to someone's house, because in our culture, something could have clung onto the van and tried to follow us home. So we went to a nearby Walmart. We stayed in the store for 45 minutes, came out, the prints were still there. So we had to call someone to get us and left the van in the parking lot until the next day. The prints eventually disappeared, and we took the van back to my cousin's house. We are never going to a ghost town again. This happened around 14 years ago. I was around 8 at the time, and at a family cookout in a haunted ghost town called Pinckneyville in South Carolina. Now I know what you're thinking. Why the hell am I at a cookout in a ghost town? Well, a family friend owns the land that surrounds it and still does. I'm not sure what the event was for, but back then we were always barbecuing and riding ATVs through the trails of rural upstate South Carolina. It is just what we did. Now, I had always heard stories about this place from my mother and father, but always brushed them off as bull or campfire tales. There's also rumors of the area being inhabited by devil worshippers, but I'm unsure if that's true or not. I just didn't really believe this place was truly haunted. Until me and my cousin were riding our ATVs down one of the many trails. Just me, him, and no one else. We're both really young. It's broad daylight, and we're riding down and both need to take a whiz. So we stop, cut off our rides, and do what we need to do. Now, I can't speak for my cousin, but I felt really weird, like something just didn't seem right. Everything seemed dead. There was no wind, no birds chirping, nothing. So after we relieved ourselves, we turned around and noticed a dilapidated building. Why we didn't notice this before, I don't know. Regardless, we were curious, but we knew enough history of the area to not go messing around in old buildings. So we looked around and quickly noticed old tombstones that could easily have been mistaken for large rocks. They were very old and weathered. We had just taken a leak on an old haunted graveyard. We looked at each other at the exact same time, and I could see the "oh shit" look in his eye before he even said it. We quickly jumped back on our ATVs and desperately tried to start the engines to no avail. I turned the key, pushed the start button, and nothing. It was almost as if the battery was dead, and my cousin's ATV again was the same. For about 10 seconds, we just tried to get our vehicles to start. And luckily, just when we thought we were screwed, at the same time, both our engines fired up and we proceeded to get out of there as quick as possible. When we got back to the rest of our families, we didn't mention it to anyone. I really don't know why, but I was just happy to be within the safety of my dad. We didn't ride the ATVs for the rest of the day, and I haven't been to Pinckneyville since. This happened to my mum, sister, and me many years ago. I was around 8, and I'm 37 now. My sister is 5 years younger. Back then, we lived in a city in the UK, in a not-so-nice part of town. Don't get me wrong, this wasn't the ghetto or the Wild West, but there were much nicer places to live. My dad was self-employed and owned a small factory in the outskirts of the city centre, about 5 miles from our home. His factory was surrounded by wasteland, mostly derelict homes and dilapidated buildings. This was all he and his business partner could afford at the time, you see. The area was grey, dirty, covered in graffiti. Hell, not even the city homeless would take refuge in the decaying buildings after dark. One day, my dad called my mum at home. He needed her to come to the factory to help him finish a job. Back then, they only had one car, so it meant us getting on the bus. I didn't mind. My 8-year-old self was full of adventure and loved the idea of riding the bus to Big Town. The bus ride was uneventful, and we braved the city traffic, eventually arriving at our stop. As described earlier, it's not the type of place people go unless they have a specific reason to go there, so it wasn't surprising we were the only ones to get off at that particular stop. We started in the direction of my dad's factory, which was just under a mile from the bus stop. My sister was asleep on her pushchair, and I was jabbering away as only an 8-year-old can, when I suddenly became aware my mum was preoccupied. I looked at her, but she told us to keep walking in a hushed voice. I noticed she kept glancing over her shoulder. I slowed down to take a look, but she tugged my arm and told me to carry on going. I remember feeling anxious as my mum walked faster, the pushchair bumping over the uneven paving slabs and my legs struggling to keep rhythm. Then I heard him. First the footsteps, clumsy and heavy, then his low, rasping voice. He was muttering incoherently, having a conversation with himself. Suddenly my mum crossed the road, holding my arm tightly while steering the pushchair with one hand. He crossed the road too. My mum cursed under her breath, and after a minute or so we crossed back again. Whenever you think you're being followed, there's always the nagging doubt you are just being paranoid. So when we crossed the same road for a 4th time in 5 minutes, with Creepy McCreepy person still hot on our tails, still muttering the occasional shout, we knew full well this guy was following us. This was back in the late 80s, so no mobile phones, no internet, and no text messaging. You really were off the grid. By now I could feel the adrenaline radiating from my mum. We were approaching a T-junction, and my dad's factory was around the corner to the left, about 400 yards down the road. If you didn't know where it was, you would assume we were heading further into the concrete ghost town. As we turned the corner, my mum told me to run as fast as I can and get my dad. I could hear my mum and the pushchair thundering behind me. My heart was pounding in my ears as I ran like our lives depended on it. My feet crunched on some broken glass, but I didn't dare slow down. I could see the small road ahead leading to the car park of the factory. I knew what I had to do. I shouted for my dad as loudly as I could. My throat was burning as I gulped for air, as hot tears stained my red cheeks. I burst through the door crying. My dad heard and came out running. I didn't need to say anything. He grabbed the nearest object and ran out the door across the park. I stood looking out the doorway, sobbing heavily, watching my dad sprint across the car park. Relief washed over me as I saw the pushchair round the corner. My mum told my dad that we were being followed and pointed in the direction we had come from. My dad took off, but came back 5 minutes later. The creep was nowhere to be seen. My dad said he'd probably run off when he heard me shouting. With all the old empty buildings and wasteland, it was just too easy to disappear. My dad wanted to take the car and drive around to see if he could find him, but my mum didn't want to be left alone, even inside the sanctuary of the factory, so he agreed to finish up the job and we could go home. My parents never reported this to the police. Living in a major city, you get all kinds of unsavory characters, and because he never physically harmed us, he didn't get the chance, mind you. They probably would have chalked up his behavior to being high or mentally ill. But either way, it scared the bejesus out of us, some creep following us around in the ghost town. The desert is a scary place for me now. It used to be a place filled with peace and serenity. But since living out there for almost 30 years, you see things. This occurrence took place in the high desert of California in the mid-90s. The whole town was once all military. There is a military plant there and a prison. The streets to this day consists of numbers and letters, for example, Avenue O and 178th Street. You always heard stories of people missing and underground tunnels. In fact, a friend of mine kept getting a draft coming in from his closet in his childhood home. After he grew up, he checked it out and found an opening to one of these such tunnels. He called me over to check it out, but after I got there and we went through the opening, I was too freaked out to go more than 10 feet in. When I turned around and told him, this might be how people disappear. You always saw things late at night off in the distance, far past the lights of the small town. Strange glowing lights that shot straight up, and things in the sky that you never spoke about. Life was pretty carefree back then. If you wanted to visit though, you would have to drive down long desert roads and sometimes end up coming home late at night in the pitch black because there were no streetlights. I remember coming home late one night with my boyfriend at the time and another friend, and we pulled over for some reason. Something compelled me to get out of the car and look to the stars. We were in the middle of nowhere, but we could hear what sounded like machinery and muffled clanks from metal. We all started looking around, but didn't see anything. Just then, we felt a vibration under our feet. I crouched down on the street and put my ear to the ground. It was coming from under us. We all listened intently and heard far down voices, but couldn't make out what was being said. We all stood up and were discussing what it might have been when we saw a small red light on the horizon that was getting closer. We piled into the car and got out of there. We only shared this with a few friends, and they had experienced the same thing. A year later, I told a friend that I had started a small business hauling, but there was a big job, so I needed to borrow a trailer. He said he had a few so I could use one, and that I should go back to his property to check it out. It was just starting to get dark when he pulled out his new toy. It was military-grade night vision binoculars. He told me to wait until it got dark to leave, because he wanted to show me something creepy. I was all in. Later we walked towards the back of his property, looking out at nothing. No lights, no roads, nothing but the barren desert. He pointed the binoculars east, and oh my, there were people out there coming out of the ground and moving around. What the hell am I looking at? He told me his family called them ground dwellers, and they're located in various parts of the desert. It gave me the heebie-jeebies, and needless to say, I never went to his house after dark again. At one point, we were living in a mobile home park past Avenue F. There was a huge tree in my yard left by the former renter. The only way to get up into it was a hole that was cut into the floor with a door on it. Under that was a rope ladder. One night I was sitting on the porch drinking a cup of tea when I heard something move up in the treehouse, and then a head popped up. It was a lady and her husband hiding. Clearly, I thought they were on drugs. I told them to come down from there, but they didn't want to. It wasn't until I threatened to call the authorities did they cautiously comply, looking all around, not wanting to be seen. By now, there's a small group of my friends and nosy neighbors gathering around, and I saw that she was terrified by something, so I asked them to come in. I made them something to eat and waited for her to calm down. She pulled out these papers. They were drawings and schematics. They looked like legal documents with government letterhead. Some of them had embossed seals and had smoke damage, even a few burnt around the edges. She told me that they were checking out this place off Barrel Springs Road. There were 2 or 3 cinder block structures there. I knew them well. A few years back I happened upon that place, and a black truck rushed down to greet me with guns drawn. She said the same thing happened to her, but she was in one of the structures, so she grabbed some of the things and her husband ran. I went over these pages and felt very uneasy reading them. Like, this was stuff people get killed over if you got out. Stupidly, I said, "Why don't you just give them back?" She said they had been running, and everywhere they went they saw a black car or van with government places showing up, just sitting there watching them. Well, I really didn't want to get too involved, especially after reading what I did. It wasn't too big for me, and I will take what I saw to the grave. So I packed them a lunch and told them they could sleep in the treehouse for the night. They did, but were gone early next morning. After that, we started seeing black vans parked on our lonely road facing the house. At one point, I even went up to one of them, but they took off as soon as I knocked on their blacked-out driver's window. Lots of unexplained things happened out there in the desert. You don't see much of it now, I think because there are more lights and people, well-lit towns and camera phones pointing in every direction. There weren't cell phones to call for help back then. I remember one time a few years later. It was a fun day. Some friends and I were in this stupid little red car called a Yugo that seemed to be on its last legs most of the time. This is where my friend's uncle told him that there was a whole abandoned town far west of the Mojave Desert, and that there were things just left there all over the place. We were so dumb. It took us a long time to get out there, and if you ask me to try and find it now, I don't know if I could. I wasn't driving, not that I would ever want to. Thinking we were lost a few times, we started seeing things. A carnival ticket booth on a trailer, broken tractors and furniture, little shacks here and there, and empty water bottles everywhere. There wasn't a store or place of business for many, many miles. I wondered how anyone could even survive in a place like this. And that's when we saw it. It was long and looked like a single wide mobile home, if you could even call it a home. It was between 60 to 80 feet long, and it was raised with the siding going all the way to the ground. It looked like something from a horror movie. It had windows lined all the way around the front of the house with old frayed curtains still hanging up and blowing in the desert breeze. There were open sections of missing siding, exposing the darkness under the house. There were dusty cars with their front doors and trunks open cans and trash all over the place, and a small fire pit in the middle of all of this. His girlfriend and I saw people that seemed to not be wearing any clothes, but their bodies weren't like ours. They were inside that house and were watching us from the windows and from the open spaces under the house. They were following us, and we were driving the length of the house. As we slowly drove past, they went from window to window and space under the house to space. They were almost inhuman. They had big eyes and pale skin, far too pale for the desert. He pulled up next to the fire pit, and despite our protests to go, he turned off the car, and his girlfriend began to cry out that we had to leave now. He didn't see what we saw. "Stop, babe, this stuff's cool," he said. Oh my gosh. I wanted to punch him in the face. We both kept looking at the people watching us while begging him to get back into the car. He picked up a long bone and was moving the soot around the fire pit. Hey, looks like someone cooked a dog. Just then he looked up at his girlfriend, leaned over to the driver's seat and grabbed his jacket and started to pull, and he finally saw what we were seeing and we said, "Oh shit." The thing under the house was swaying back and forth with his hands on both sides of the opening of the siding. He was staring at us almost with intent to lunge. He tried to start the car, but it failed. Thinking that this was the end, eaten in the desert, I started to beat on the back of his seat, screaming to start the car, and after 3 tries, we tore out of there in a cloud of dust. We pulled over far from that location and tried to compose ourselves. Never, ever would we return. I don't think ghost towns from this point on were a good idea. We didn't talk about what we saw after that. I think we were in disbelief that it even happened. There were so many things that occurred in the desert back in the day, too many to even come close to tell you. But I do believe that there are things we do not, and maybe will never, understand there. Also, just a tidbit of information. Rosamond way back in the day was a toxic dump site. That's why the houses were so cheap. You ask anyone now, and they won't know what you're talking about. Several years ago, my ex-partner and I visited his parents in North Yorkshire, England for a short break. We did lots of sightseeing and visiting while we were there. One of the days his parents asked if we would like them to take us out on a day to a place called Ravenscar. Them driving, knowing how much local knowledge his father had of the area, because before he retired he was high up in the local council. And we decided it would be a nice day out, because it's always nice to go places where people have knowledge of the area and local history. Ravenscar has quite a bit of history, going back to being a Roman signal station, but more recently in the late 19th and earlier 20th century, they tried turning it into a holiday resort like Scarborough, which isn't too far away. This fascinated us, because it's one of Britain's ghost towns, because it was never finished and was abandoned. However, I must add at the time of us going there, we knew nothing apart from the bit of information his father gave us. Anyway, when we were there, he drove us around the site slowly. When the finished roads showed us points of interest, like complete pavements, drains, areas marked out where hotels and houses were going to be built, but just never were. Just like driving around a small housing estate where the roads and pavements were finished but the buildings were never built. It was fascinating and quite eerie. There's also a mine and old brickwork as well as an abandoned railway line. Anyway, now the weird bit. Several years later we visited again, this time taking my children. We thought it would be fun to take them there and show them a bit of local history and let them run around. We told them all about it and some of the things that they would see. But just as we drove in, we thought we must have taken a wrong turn, because there was nothing there, just a big field. We drove a short distance to the information center to ask them where it was, because we couldn't remember. The woman looked at us like we were insane and said, "This is the right place." Extremely confused, we decided to walk back to the site to see if we could see what we did several years earlier. But it was nothing like it. There was just dirt tracks and no roads, no pavements, only remnants of where they had been. The odd drain, but nothing like what we'd seen. By now the children thought we'd gone mad, and honestly we couldn't give them answers. When we got back to his parents' house and told them about our experience, we only felt more insane, because they told us what we described didn't exist, and clearly had been something very different to what was there now, and also than what his parents were seeing when they drove us around that day. What happened? I'll never know. But it stayed with me, and I often think about it, because it was such a surreal experience. About 8 years ago, my family and I took a trip down to Tombstone, Arizona, one of the more famous ghost towns in that area of the US. I was quite a bit into the paranormal at the time, so naturally was more than excited to stop by the Haunted Birdcage Theatre. No, I didn't see anything at the time while taking the photos. However, about 5 minutes after taking that photo, my brother started freaking out about seeing a figure in the same area. It's neat that after looking through the photos we had something to back his experience up. My favorite thing about the photos is that this isn't just some random black blob. this is an actual female figure. Even with the image quality being what it is, you can still zoom in and make out a surprising amount of detail. A necklace is easily visible. You can also make out bare shoulders and where the dress starts. Details of the face are harder to make out, but I almost want to say it looks like she's wearing a bird mask. The other photos pretty much debunk most possibilities of this being camera trickery, especially when you look at the side-by-side comparison. But hey, if anyone can come up with a reasonable non-paranormal explanation for this photo, I'd love to hear it. Needless to say, I've been pretty convinced of the paranormal ever since. A couple of years back, me and a friend were doing a road trip. It was here where we discovered something rather unusual, a ghost town. I don't want to say exactly where it is for fear of sounding insane. Anyway, we approached the town with trepidation. Of course, we didn't realize it was abandoned at first. Roads unkept, grass growing everywhere along with weeds extremely high, houses completely torn apart. Doors had been ripped off the hinges, windows shattered, and a whole load of graffiti. As we drove around, it became increasingly more apparent that people no longer inhabited this area. Roots of trees were already taking back the road, and foliage was covering a large part of some of the houses. We drove around for a little bit, and after getting bored after about 5 minutes, we decided it was enough driving around and wanted to explore just a little bit. We left our vehicles and looked around. In the middle of the village, there was a bandstand with a square that, despite being abandoned, was still in pretty good shape. There was something about it that really drew me to it. So, as my friend went to look at one of the houses behind where we parked the car, I decided to go look at that instead. As my feet started walking across the grass, I approached the bandstand with trepidation. I climbed the 3 or 4 steps to be on the concrete of the structure and looked around and surveyed the area. That's when I noticed something very eerie. I looked up. There was a pentagram painted on the roof of the bandstand, and as I looked around, I saw a chicken carcass, or what I think was a chicken carcass, hanging from a rope by the top. It was severely decayed. It had obviously been there for a very long time. The meat was partially still on it, blackened and disgusting. The funny thing is, I didn't smell anything, but the moment I saw it, I bolted and started running back to the vehicle. But my friend had locked the car and was still in one of the houses. I started screaming for him, and he told me to calm down and that it was probably just a prank. He convinced me that I was being ridiculous, and he carried on the exploration. I chose to sit by the car and wait, however. A few minutes later, do I hear my friend's voice from the house. He's screaming, taking 2 steps at a time, runs out the hole where the door was and unlocks the car and jumps into the driver's seat. I don't even need to ask. I'm looking at the house where he's running out of, and that's where I see a man, completely disheveled and insane looking, with a crazy look in his eye, wielding a blood-stained hatchet. We don't speak, we just drive. We stopped at a gas station and discussed what we saw before filling up our gas. However, our dialogue was extremely limited. You see the guy? Yeah. Do you think he strung up that chick in there? Yeah. Yeah, me too. That was about as much as we said about it. And when we looked at each other, there was an unspoken sort of agreement that we would never discuss this again. Why was a crazy man living in the middle of nowhere in a ghost town? I don't think I'll ever know, nor do I want to find out. My cousin told me this story a few years ago. He was insisting I never tell anyone because they would think he's crazy. My cousin Jesse lives in Mexico. He comes over sometimes, and he always has another cousin called Johnny, who works with a small flower delivery company. It was Friday around 6 p.m. Jesse and Johnny were hanging out together playing games when Johnny's cell phone rings. It was his boss from the flower delivery company. Apparently they had received a late order and they needed Johnny to deliver. Johnny told Jesse if he wanted to go with him, and Jesse agreed. They arrived picking up the flowers and a paper with the address so they knew where to deliver the flowers to. It's a small town about 25 miles from Johnny's house. When they arrived to the address, there's no one in sight. It started getting a little dark, so they decided to cruise around the small abandoned town, then check out the house again to see if maybe the people had arrived home. They arrived back to the addresses and still nothing, no lights whatsoever. The only lights they had were the car headlights. Across the street, there was a man who appeared to just be stood in darkness. The only part the lights would reveal was his waist and nothing else. Johnny asked the man if he knew the owners and what time they'd be back. The man told them the owners would be back in any minute, but not once did he step into the light. Johnny then told the man if he would leave the flowers in his care and when the owner arrives if he could give them to them. The man gladly accepted. As the man approached the car, Jesse said something made both of them look down at the man's feet. He said that at that moment he was filled with terror, as where the man's feet were supposed to be were large black hairy hooves. As the man reached out, they noticed the same with his hands. Jesse quickly told Johnny they needed to leave now. Johnny threw the flowers at the man. They got into the car and sped off. Jesse said as they got into the car, the man or thing was still talking about payment for the flowers, but they ignored him as they didn't want to be there a second longer. After that, they arrived at a gas station and brought some drinks and cigarettes as they needed to calm down from the scare they just had. They kept questioning each other on what they saw, but they couldn't believe it. Once they arrived back to the flower place, they told their boss they had been robbed, since the flowers were expensive and no one would believe what really happened. A few days later, Johnny went around asking about the place and people would say the town belonged to the devil himself. Today, Johnny doesn't work there anymore, and Jesse says he still has nightmares about the incident. I actually believe him, since my family has seen so many encounters with the paranormal. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. As I said at the start of the video, if you are interested in checking out my pop bass, it's a really cool app. Content is being produced daily on there, and it's quite a bit of fun, if I do say so myself. So if you would like to check it out, feel free. It's quite good. Link at the top of the description. And yeah, just tell me what you think. Tell me in the description or the suggestion box within the app itself. It's a fun place. Anyway, if you liked today's video, don't forget to let me know. I've been meaning to do ghost towns for a while, and I'm hoping to do a part 2 of this, a second edition if you will. So if you have a story, ghost town or not, feel free to send it to me. Email and link to my Reddit page in the description in order for you to do so. Also, as always, a huge thank you to my incredible patrons who really help keep everything running. If you're interested in donating as little as $1 a month to help keep things running over here, as always, it is extremely appreciated, and you can check that info out in the description too. In any case, it's now time for me to sign off. Stay awesome. Merry Christmas Eve, if it is where you are, and I'll see you in the next one.